Ask for a chat. The light's going out of your blue eyes. Like all the summer days are gone.
Hi everybody, welcome to the second session of Reid Along, the Vampire Lestat book club. My name is Kirsten and it is so wonderful to have you here. If you are just joining us, Reid Along is essentially a semester-long seminar course, book study, book club centered around reading The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice in anticipation for AMC's Interview with the Vampire Season 3. We have discussion questions, we have a Google Classroom, we have a hashtag, and most importantly, we have these videos which come out every 2 weeks, which are centered around talking about certain specific aspects of the book and sections that we have read. I will link previous videos for Reid Along down below, as well as links to my Instagram and my Twitter and our Google Classroom. So that way, if you would like to find out some more information about it, possibly join us and share your insights on this amazingly detailed book, please do so. But otherwise, if you have been here for Reid Along, if you are returning, if you've been here for a couple days, if you've sent in any answers, if you've supported, thank you so much for joining me once again. I am so excited about these two specific sections that we read, and talking about them and reading through your guys' answers was, there's so much to say in such little time, but I'm really excited to get into this. We had a total of 23,417 words sent in answer to the questions that were for these two sections of The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice, bringing our total thus far to 56,123 words for the first two sessions of Reid Along. We did have some people send in some answers for the first session since, so I have calculated those in as well. The reason I'm including a word count is because I think a lot of us are on AO3 and we look at the word count of fanfics a lot, and we know how much 56,000 words really is, and I think it's crazy that we have that many words sent in already in response when we are only, after talking through today, 129 pages into this book. So that's a lot of things to say about Vampire Lestat, and more specifically about these two sections. So I don't want to waste any more time, and I would like for us to get started on discussing all the amazing things that you guys had to say regarding what we read this week. So without further ado, welcome to session 2 of Reid Along, the Vampire Lestat book club, where we began reading The Early Education and Adventures of the Vampire Lestat, and specifically Part 1, Lelio Rising, and Part 2, The Legacy of Magnus. Part 1, Lelio Rising, was about 44 pages in length, and Part 2, The Legacy of Magnus, was about 60 pages, giving us a total of 104 pages for this first section, meaning that we really got into the meat of this book and kind of started headfirst into all the trials and tribulations of the Vampire Lestat. Alright, so our first part that we read was Part 1, Lelio Rising, which had 3 questions. And the first question was, Lestat de Lioncourt is a famous anti-hero in literary history. All heroes, anti and otherwise, have an origin story, or more specifically, have a transformative event that sets them apart from the ordinary human. For Lestat, this origin story is the wolves. What were your initial reactions or thoughts to the scene with the wolves, and how do you think this event will impact the remainder of the novel? So I think first we just have to listen to this opening line. This opening line. In the winter of my 21st year, I went out alone on horseback to kill a pack of wolves. We discussed it some in the last session, and a couple people were very much in agreement that the tonal shift between Interview with the Vampire and the beginning of the Vampire Lestat, so I'm the Vampire Lestat, I'm immortal, like, you know, like that thing, it was really kind of difficult, honestly. I know some people really loved it right away. I was not one of those people. I struggled tremendously. I actually put the book down and didn't pick it back up for a couple months when I first read the introduction. And so I had a friend who had pushed me to keep reading, and she said, you just have to get to the wolves. And I was like, okay. And I remember you can feel the immediate shift as soon as you read this line in Lelio Rising, that okay, Lestat wasn't quite what he was selling himself out to be, in the sense that he's more, you know? And I think it has to do a lot with, it's a common trope, and I think it can be traced back to Lestat in a lot of different aspects. Anne Rice is an originator of a lot of different tropes, especially in vampire media, but in other things as well. But the character that hides a lot of their insecurities and vulnerability behind these very like high walls of overconfidence and kind of being an asshole sometimes. And Lestat does that, you know? He's super sure of himself, and he's very confident, at least like you think so. And I don't think he's not confident, but I think obviously there's nuances, there's layers, and I feel like this is where you get to see, oh, those layers are deep and they run real deep. So answers here were wonderful. So Alice said that her first reaction was that, oh fuck yeah, this is gonna be cool, followed swiftly by, no, not the dogs. The dogs. Let's talk about the dogs. First of all, I've seen people say it already, and I agree. I know that, for those of you that haven't read, shut your ears for a second. I know that Lestat gets mojo in book 4. I think he should just get a dog now. I think Lil Rockstar self can handle having a dog. There will be people to help him with the dogs while he's touring. I give him a dog. I have a friend, she's not reading the books, she has no intention of reading the books, but we've been talking a lot recently about the vampire Lestat, and we were talking about the wolf killing scene and whatever, and I was reading her the part where, it's right here at the bottom of page 23, he's talking about the dogs, and he says, now these were powerful beasts, as I said, these mastiffs. I'd bred them and trained them myself, and each weighed upwards of 200 pounds. I always hunted with them, and though I speak of them as dogs now, they were known only by their names to me then, and when I saw them die, I knew for the first time what I had taken on and what might happen. Their names! Like, Anne, can you name them? So, Roland, first job, I need names for the dogs. Just kidding, and then I'm gonna get overly attached and I'm gonna cry. Oh my god. So, no, not the dogs. Then Lestat equipping himself with all these gnarly weapons was top level badass, and honestly, I really hope we get the visuals in the show, because Lestat riding out to the snow with his arsenal and dogs running alongside him would just be so good. Especially if we get a parallel shot of him on the motorbike. I feel like they could play those two scenes off of each other in a really cool way. If they do, they could even have Bach playing in both scenes while it's happening. Bach, it's always Bach. Now, can you imagine? Like the idea of sort of like the motorcycle scene in season 2, episode 2, with that first hunt that Louis and Claudia go out with the theater coven vampires on, and just how powerful, you know, this idea of these vampires together are, hunting kind of like a pack, and then you have this idea of Lestat riding out as a human, paired alongside him on a motorcycle going off to do stuff too. And y'all know how I feel about the motorcycle. Alice, you then went on to say Lestat goes somewhat feral, which honestly is a good look for him. I don't make the rules. Yeah. And the fact that he didn't feel any fear during any of this, he just kind of accepted that it was happening and that he might die, but it never once put him off the course of action. That speaks so loudly to what motivates Lestat. He has a plan, he does the plan. It might go horribly wrong, but that is just an accepted part of it. When it comes to action, Lestat does not second guess himself, and he will push through until he gets to the end of it. There might be regrets and thoughts and emotions after the fact, but not during. And I think we see that really heavily in season 2, episode 7 with the trial, because, and I know it's been said like in interviews and stuff following all this, and I know they haven't gone into too much detail because we're gonna get some of it probably in season 3, whatever. But you know, Lestat goes to that trial and we don't know exactly what his plan was, like if he had one at all. But the moment that he turns around and sees Louis, like there's a vague plan in place now, and he's gonna make it work, and he'll deal with the consequences of that afterwards. Like it doesn't matter how he gets Louis out of there. Louis got to get out of there, which I think is why, you know, it's much more loaded than this, but why he could accept Armand taking credit for it and why everything, because it didn't matter how they got to that conclusion. They just had to get to that conclusion, which is that Louis would survive. Because again, if he was thinking, he probably would have made sure Louis wasn't buried alive in a wall for a month. Armand. But alas, that's another story for another day. Nikki, you said that as for the scene with the wolves itself, it was rather telling that as Lestat goes off to face such a dangerous situation, he has no fear of what could go wrong. He's very brazen. And in the midst of the fight with the wolves, his dogs are dead, his horse gravely wounded, his own life in jeopardy. He doesn't consider giving up. He just keeps going. And this is an insight to Lestat as a character that will impact the remainder of all the novels. Despite how hopeless things become, Lestat continues and does not give up. He is relentless. I think this is a conversation we'll probably talk about a little bit more in this video when we get to his turning, but anything could happen and Lestat will continue. I feel like he is the definition of immortality in a lot of ways, because I truly believe that even if he died, something about him would continue on. It would continue to fight because he just does not give up. It is so inherently part of who he is to just continue to push forward. And yeah, this opening scene just showcases exactly what he's willing to do to make sure that he can push forward. Tommy, you said one thing that really stood out in the segment was that Lestat was completely unafraid up until the dogs were killed. Up until that moment, he seems indifferent, almost ignorant of the actual danger he is facing. It opens up the question of whether he's ignorant or he simply does not care. Once he does luck in, though, the fight against the wolves turns him into something else. He goes wild into almost a manic state, and when he returns to himself, he becomes deeply depressed. I do not believe he ever fully left that state, and that fight truly never left him. And I think that's true. I think that's why, moving a little bit forward, it's such a thing for Magnus, because it never does really leave him. He does constantly sit there, and some part of him lives in this fight with the wolves, and it has so much to do with this brush with mortality. And I think it's something that he and Nikki will discuss during like their time before running off to Paris, that, you know, I think he realizes that if he were to die on that mountain with those wolves, that what did he do with his life? You know, he had all these things he wanted to do, and it was constantly pulled away from them. And I think it really hits him that this moment of mortality, like really facing him head on, he would have, in his own opinion, accomplished nothing. What did he do for himself? Nothing. Savage, you said that the wolves are the embodiment of Lestat's inner turmoil. This encounter forces him to confront chaotic realities, shaping his future choices between human values and predatory nature. They also foreshadow the internal and external battles he will confront and highlight his ongoing transformation into something beyond human. So much. Other people talk about it, and it's something I've been highlighting as I've been reading, which is Lestat uses a lot of bestial adjectives to describe himself. He will sometimes be it's very blunt. He'll talk about crawling like a lizard, or he'll talk about comparing himself to a wolf, a lion, whatever. But sometimes it's just the general description of the action or himself. He'll talk about snarling and roaring. He'll talk about claws. Everything is very just so beast-like when he describes himself, which makes me really, really, really want to write The Beauty and the Beast Lestat AU that I've had planned for 9 years. He really is, in a lot of ways, constantly viewing himself as monstrous. And I think it's an internal thing that he faces over and over again when he talks about how he wanted to kill his brothers and his father. When he talks about all these things, he views himself as monstrous in a lot of ways. And then he quite literally becomes one. And while he is really good at kind of going with the flow on becoming one, we see the impact that it takes on him. We know that it's not easy. And I think it's something he's been fighting for a very long time. Melissa, you said he was already feeling like an outcast before all of this happened, but I think the killing of the wolves is the moment that he realizes just how truly he does not belong. And I think one of the scenes that stands out to me with the wolf killing scene is right when he returns home. And it's where his brother Augustine is just nasty. And so he says, by the time I reached the castle gates, I think I was not Lestat. I was someone else altogether, staggering into the great hall with that wolf over my shoulders. The heat of the carcass very much diminished now, and the sudden blaze of the fire an irritant in my eyes. I was beyond exhaustion. And though I began to speak as I saw my brothers rising from the table and my mother patting my father, who was blind already then and wanted to know what was happening, I don't know what I said. I know my voice was very flat, and there was some sense in me of the simplicity of describing what had happened. And then, sort of like that. But my brother Augustine suddenly brought me to myself. He came towards me with the light of the fire behind him and quite distinctly broke the low monotone of my words with his own. You little bastard, he said coldly. You didn't kill 8 wolves. His face had an ugly, disgusted look to it. But the remarkable thing was this. Almost as soon as he spoke these words, he realized for some reason that he had made a mistake. Maybe it was the look on my face. Maybe it was my mother's murmured outrage or my other brother not speaking at all. It was probably my face. Whatever it was almost instantaneous, and the most curious look of embarrassment came over him. And I think about how Lestat has been ridiculed and looked down upon by his brothers and family his whole life, and suddenly in this moment, Augustine has enough sense to shut up, to not say anything else. And I think about what look must have been on Lestat's face then. You know, how scary must he have looked in that moment for his own older brother, who's been nothing but a bully and a horrible person to him, to shut up. Melissa, you went on to say that he only starts to take on the gravity and the danger of the situation once his dogs are hurt and killed, followed by his mare, which he is forced to kill himself. He does not dwell on his feelings during this specific scene, but I felt he was more affected than he let on in his narration. He acknowledged that he came home changed, and the wolf scene does not represent the first time that he's killed, but it seems to represent his first real brush with mortality and death. Taylor, I loved reading your answer because you start off by saying, I heard rumblings of the wolves before reading the book, but I really tried to avoid spoilers. Is this your first time reading the wolf scene? I feel so honored that people are sharing their first time reading the wolf scene with us, because it's an insane scene to read, and to be reading it right now with everyone is really, really great. You went on to say that it does a really good job in the aftermath of showing who he is, because Lestat doesn't really address the trauma that comes with this event. Rather, it seems he enters a catatonic state for a bit, and I think the wolves really set him up for who he will be as a vampire. Elsa, you said, I guess the first time that all this happens, it brings out the killer in him, which he talks about with Gabrielle in the chapters after, and it's interesting to see how both of them already have this in them as humans. I did not put any specific questions about Gabrielle in this session for Reid Along, but there will be some for the next session. I feel like Gabrielle is so complex regarding everything with Lestat, and I feel like that honestly probably needs to be its own discussion at some point. But Gabrielle shaping the killer that Lestat is in a lot of ways, maybe not intentionally, but doing so, is something that we see happen throughout this scene, and we see continue throughout Lelio Rising as a section. And I think it's really interesting what that means for Lestat in the long term. All right, Katie, you said that for how important the wolf killer persona is to Lestat and how significant of an event it is in his life and in the novel, the first time I read it, I'm always surprised at how little space and time the actual fight takes up. Such a huge event happens in about 3 pages, and the impacts of such a relatively short scene are felt entirely throughout the novel. Yes, Anne does that a lot. I say as I reach for Interview with the Vampire. One of Anne's strengths as a writer, in my opinion, is that she can take a scene that is relatively short and she can make it the most impactful thing you've ever read. If you look at Interview with the Vampire, the trial and like Claudia's death in the book is literally it's about like 4.5 pages. It's 4.5 pages. The whole trial and the whole part of Claudia's death, because Louis doesn't see it, right? Louis doesn't witness Claudia's death, which is part of it. Claudia's death, 4.5 pages. And it is the shaping of the Vampire Chronicles. You know, the entire Vampire Chronicles is here because Claudia dies. It's the inevitable. It's the what had to happen. It's, you know, the devastation is what ultimately leads to all the vampires telling their life stories. Is many a reason, but Louis not being able to process and deal with the grief of the loss of Claudia, and doing this interview in the books, it's very much a warning, and it leads to this book being published and Lestat being like, what? I'm making my own book, leading to the whole Queen of the Damned thing, leading to Tales about, like, it just continues. And it's 4.5 pages. It's crazy. It's just wild. But you went on to say that in addition to Lestat's prowess as an actor, of course, and the performance that he puts on, fighting off a pack of 8 wolves is something that no regular human could ever survive, but there is a resilience in him that allows him to do it, even if it breaks him a little bit. This resilience is ultimately what Lestat uses to push forward in his life as a vampire, because it's his nature to push forward and to seek out what the world has to offer him. Vampire life is not made for the weak, and Lestat, through surviving the wolves and his family in Paris, has proven that he's not weak. And that has so much to say about some other characters in this book. HP, you said that this scene lets us bear witness to Lestat's vulnerability and empathy. It's one of the few times that Lestat even describes himself as being genuinely afraid of something, even though the fear doesn't kick in until his dogs are taken down. Him admitting fear in the first place assumes some kind of vulnerability, and his treatment of both the dogs and the horse in this segment show a nice display of his sensitivity. You talk about how Lestat fights and talks about how much of the fighting is about instinct for him, and I think that's something that's really important when it comes to even like his vampirism, and I think why he's so good at it. Again, we'll get into it when we actually get there, but as we know, Lestat doesn't have a teacher, right? There's no teacher telling him these things. It's instinctual, and he's got really good instincts. That's why he's such a good hunter. Valerie, like Taylor, you're sharing your first experience of reading The Wolves with us, so thank you, because that's a crazy thing to share with everybody. So you said I had heard about the scene with the wolves from other people familiar with the novels, but nothing could have prepared me for the experience of reading it. It's one thing to hear about something and another to immerse yourself in it fully, and reading about it was just as a transformative experience as it was for Lestat. I guess not literally. It made me understand who he is as a character and how it foreshadows how he maneuvers through life, and especially how he deals with conflict. And Carolyn, you talked about Lestat's horse being this gothic description. Ugh. The horse, I did read that to my friend too, and she was like, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. I'm like, right. The horse scene it's awful. The horse scene is on page 25 in The Vampire Lestat. And it starts about halfway through the page where he says, that was the end of it. The pack was dead. I was alive. And the only sound in the empty snow-covered valley was my own breathing and the rattling shriek of my dying mare who lay yards away from me. I'm not sure I had my reason. I'm not sure the things that went through my mind were thoughts. I wanted to drop down in the snow, and yet I was walking away from the dead wolves towards the dying horse. As I came close to her, she lifted her neck, straining up to rise on her front legs, and gave one of those shrill trumpeting pleas again. The sound bounced off the mountains. It seemed to reach heaven. And I stood staring at her dark, broken body against the whiteness of the snow, the dead hindquarters and the struggling forelegs, the nose lifted skyward, ears pressed back, and the huge innocent eyes rolling up into her head as the rattling cry came out of her. She was like an insect half mashed into the floor, but she was no insect. She was my struggling, suffering mare. She tried to lift herself again. I took my rifle from the saddle. I loaded it. And as she lay tossing her head, trying vainly to lift herself once more with that shrill trumpeting, I shot her through the heart. Now she looked all right. She lay still and dead, and the blood ran out of her, and the valley was quiet. I was shuddering. I heard an ugly choking noise come from myself, and I saw the vomit spewing out onto the snow before I realized it was mine. The smell of the wolf was all over me, and the smell of blood. And I almost fell over when I tried to walk. That scene is so visceral, and I'm not really great at picturing things when I read them. I've never been great at that. I wish I was. But it's one of those scenes that it's so viscerally described. I feel like I can see it. I feel like it's this far away shot of, you can just see these figures kind of in this valley of snow, and there's red all on the snow, and I feel like you could hear that echoing of the horse. It's awful. Like, it's just this awful scene. And I think it's going to be so visually amazing on screen. Like, it's like I'm not excited because it's a bad moment, but it's going to be so visually stunning. Anyway, I think about seeing some of this stuff and the visualization of it a lot. And I get very excited. Anyway, I got off topic. Carolyn, you went on to say that that kind of this killing of the horse resonates with the whole like Nikki thing as well. I find it interesting that it is Gabrielle who creates this hunter Lestat, not his own innate desire, though he does excel. She teaches Lestat that when in deep pain, action is a means of escape, and she gives him all the weapons and animals to become the hunter that she wishes she could be. And then you said that you've been reading folklore foretellings for seventh sons, and it says there's a Romanian folklore that a seventh son is fated to become a vampire. I'm gonna look that up. I want to know. That's amazing. I know a lot about seventh son folklore, but I don't think I've ever heard of the one with the fated to become a vampire. That's very on the nose. I think Gabrielle needs to be a whole conversation. And it's not necessarily a good one. It's not necessarily a bad one either. It's just complex. But I think Gabrielle, ultimately, if we were like to summarize, and we see it more as we continue to move forward, is that Lestat is who she wants to be. Like, she wants to be him. She's envious of him being a man. She's envious of him being strong. She's envious of... I think she's envious of him being a seventh son. You know, one thing is, if he were the firstborn, if he was the heir, I don't know if he would have ever left. I think him kind of quite literally not having anything, should he leave or stay, is a huge driving factor in him ultimately leaving. If he was the heir to the Lioncourt position in their little village, I don't know if he would have ever left. I mean, we'll never know. I think there's a lot of what ifs always, and I think this is one of them, and I don't know if we'd know why he left. All right, question number 2 for Lelio Rising said, in chapter 5, Nicolas declares what has been on his and Lestat's mind all along, that they should run away to Paris. Though this inspires joy for Lestat at first, the joy quickly vanishes. On page 49, Lestat narrates a shift from what he calls the golden moment to the dark moment. Well, if there had been a golden moment in the room, it was gone now, and something different started to happen. I should call it the dark moment. And this continues heavily for the next several pages. Why do you think this shift happens, and what is significant about it? So I was very interested in reading what people had to say about this, and I'll share why in a moment. So Alice, you said that largely because of Nicky's pessimism, Lestat is very optimistic, and when met with Nicky's pessimism, it doesn't seem to affect him that much, but it seems that undoubtedly some of it will worm its way in after spending so long with him. Nicky, you said that this is significant because that all goes back to the witch's place, and the witch's place represents Lestat's struggle with existentialism, religion, and death. And the witch's place, something that we definitely need to talk about at some point. Tommy, you said that this moment is the birth of Lestat's drive to find meaning, which I think is really important to who he is and kind of this whole thing with, it's too much of a spoiler. I'm gonna hold off on saying anything. Savage, I really loved your answer. You said initially he feels joy thinking about escaping to Paris with Nicolas, which symbolizes freedom and adventure from this very suffocating life. However, as he realizes the limitations of this dream, the excitement fades. The dark moment reveals dangers and uncertainties that can lead to betrayal. This change highlights the theme of youthful idealism versus harsh reality, marking Lestat's loss of innocence and his growing awareness of life's complexities. It starts to show Lestat's deeper character, revealing his impulsiveness, passion, and introspection while hinting at his transformation into a vampire. And I do think the loss of innocence, it's funny because I think obviously we can look at his turning into a vampire as a loss of innocence for many a reason, but I do think that this dark moment and that beginning of like an existential crisis is because when you start to realize that everything out there is so much more, it can be terrifying. I think for some people it can be freeing, and I think it can be terrifying. And I think for Lestat, it's like, oh my God, what? Melissa, you said, I think what's so significant about this is that it sounds like a premonition. Human life seems meaningless, and soon enough, Lestat will leave that life behind and get another one, an eternal one. And that will oftentimes feel even more meaningless. He's never gonna die and will never get the answers that he's looking for in these pages when he asks everyone around him about God and life and death. I feel like that's its own existential crisis that he needs to go on. I'm just going to be real honest there. Yasra, you said that he is hit with how meaningless Gabrielle's death will be, and which on that night in the witch's place, and on the heels of his and Nicky's latest debate about goodness and sin, leads to him suddenly to be struck with the realization that he does not believe in God or in an afterlife, and that his life and all life is ultimately meaningless with no clear-cut ending or answers. He's basically having an existential crisis brought on by his unexamined until now atheist beliefs. When he goes to the monastery, there's a line, and I don't know if it's before or after this, where he talks about how he didn't believe in God at the monastery, he believed in the people at the monastery. And so I think there's like a part of him that's always vaguely been aware of this, but I don't think that, I don't think he's really looked at it and analyzed it until this moment, and all of a sudden it just sends him spiraling. I feel like it's important to note and to think about, and I want to do a video on it really badly. I love historical contextual lenses for looking at literature, and I think understanding the French Revolution and everything that was in the air with the French Revolution is imperative to understanding Lestat and Nicky as characters. I think it shapes who they are so vividly, and I think this little bit of existentialism is rooted so much in that. Taylor, you said that this feels like a premonition for what's to come. The dark moment leads to the dark gift. HP, you said that, talking about him and Nicky, that they find solace in one another, being two outcasts and artists trapped in the small town. However, as this goes on, we start to see that their differences shape who they are, and despite his rough upbringing, Lestat remains very much an optimist, hoping for a better life and believing in the good of artistry, while Nicky is a pessimist who is depressed in such a way that he feels like goodness is irrelevant and that artistry is sinful, and he delights in partaking in it because of this and in spite of it. This clash in their beliefs leads them to actually clash, leading to multiple metaphorical shifts from golden to dark moments. And then he went on to say at the end, I thought this was kind of crazy, which was, on top of all this, his relationship with Nicolas starts to grow thin around this time, marking what is another shift. And it should be noted that Lestat makes a point to say that he feared the most while living in Paris was dusk, the time that marks the literal transition from golden to dark. I don't like Nicky, and I try to hold back, and I think I'm very good at separating my personal dislike from the story. I understand his importance. I do. Like, there is no doubt about his importance. I dislike him as a character. And a lot of what you were talking about there highlights why. And I'm sure I'll at some point get more into the why. But yeah, Nicky frustrates me beyond belief. And that constant pessimism is a driving force behind that. And I do think that this is the moment that we start to see their relationship shift. And what I think is interesting about that is when you really look at Nicky and Lestat's relationship in the books, it's so short. It is so short. They meet in January, and by August they go to Paris, and by October Lestat's been taken, and then he's gone for months, and then he comes back and like they hate each other. I mean, just in general. And it's such a short relationship. I will forever be grateful to Nicky for one thing, and that is that I do not think that Lestat would have left the village without Nicky. And I'm really grateful for that, because I think Lestat would have died there. I think he would have done something reckless and stupid and got himself killed. And so I'm very grateful for that. But, oof. But Alex, you said that I have nothing to address here because your thread on this was so good, I don't need to form my own thoughts right now. So I did kind of have ulterior motives in this question, but in my defense, I have a reason that I asked it. So in my reread of this a couple weeks ago and prep for this session, I got to this part and was just kind of struck by how sudden this existential crisis is. Yes, I know that there are things leading up to this, and I know that him learning about Gabrielle's impending death is a huge force of nature behind this like onslaught of emotions that he faces. I get that. I'm aware, but it still feels like all of a sudden he's just this incomprehensible like mess for a while. And it comes right when they're like, oh, we're gonna go to Paris. And then he's like, oh my God, we're all gonna die and nothing has meaning. And I was a little confused about it. And so I called my friend, who is my oldest Vampire Chronicles friend, and she is old school fan. And so I called her and I'm like, hey, I got a question. And I asked her about this moment. And I'm like, it's that shift from the golden moment to the dark moment, and like he just like loses it. And so she was sharing some of her thoughts on it and everything, but she also got real meta with me. And so I'm gonna get real meta with you for a second, which is, if anybody's not read, Catherine Ramsland has a biography on Anne Rice called Prism of the Night. And it goes through all of Anne's life and her writings and what led to a lot of these writings and everything. And this specific moment is talked about in this. So starting on page 96 of Prism of the Night, we get into when Anne and her husband Stan were living in California, and Stan was a professor and he was teaching, and this is the height of the hippie movement in California. So halfway through the page, on page 96, it says, smoking marijuana soon became popular, and it seemed to present now exciting ways to perceive the world. Stan was eager to try it as an aesthetic exercise to enlarge the sensory experience. So Stan gets into trying some drugs, and Anne follows suit, and there's like this whole thing going into it, but she talks about how Anne does start taking some drugs. And it says, I was always a bit scared of what they were doing, Anne said. She admitted, however, that scenes in her later books may have been influenced by the concept of the process. One notable example is where the protagonist, Louis, from her first novel, is transformed into a vampire, and he watches in fascination as his body goes through the stages of change. And then it quotes a little bit of Louis' transformation in an interview with Vampire, where it says, it was as if I had only just been able to see colors and shapes for the first time. I was so enthralled with the buttons on Lestat's black coat that I looked at nothing else for a long time. When I saw the moon on the flagstones, I became so enamored with it that I must have spent an hour there. And with my awakened senses, I had to preside over the death of my body. I simply regret I was not more attentive to the process. And so Anne talks about how this influences how she writes a lot of her characters. But however, this specific moment in The Vampire Lestat is talked about on page 100 of Prism of the Night. So it says, at one point, Anne had an inner confrontation provoked by pot that profoundly affected her. I had an absolutely devastating experience with it on the Berkeley campus, said Anne. I had smoked it and I was suddenly realized that we might not even know when we died what this existence was all about. I was a basket case for 6 months. I could hardly function. She had firmly believed that one day things would make sense eventually somehow, that there would be some clarity and knowledge with a higher, more holy form of existence. And then it says that she went on for help to the campus clinic, but it proved fruitless. She called friends to tell him of her negative epiphany, and they failed to see why she was having such a devastating insight. And she said nothing looked the same. She saw flesh and blood decay. She saw people dead. She felt herself swallowed into a void. I was just walking around saying, we're all gonna die. I never got over it. I went to class, I did what I had to do, but I was a gibbering idiot and never went away. I never again felt the same way about life and death. She captured the hollowness and horror years later in several novels, most dramatically in The Vampire Lestat. The young Lestat is in deep discussion with his friend Nicolas when the dark moment drops on him in the way a predatory cat might spring from above. What he says is what Anne felt, and it goes on to quote where he says, I realized aloud in the midst of saying it that even when we die, we probably don't find out the answer as to why we were ever alive. We'll never know, and all this meaninglessness will just go on, and we'll just be gone, dead, dead, dead without ever knowing. There was no judgment day, no final explanation, no luminous moment in which all terrible wrongs could be made right, all horrors redeemed. No one was ever going to tell us anything. No, I didn't understand it at this moment. I saw it, and I began to make a single sound of, oh. I said it again, oh, and then I said it louder and louder and louder, and I dropped the wine bottle on the floor. And so it goes on to talk about how, Lestat going and questioning all the people around him was what Anne did. She contacted friends, trusted people, and was like, what are we supposed to do? Like, there were no answers, and they were just like, girly pop. We've all known that. And she's like, why are you not freaking out? You need to be freaking out the way I'm freaking out. And I think we see it with Nicky too, in the sense with his nihilism. Like, why does he need to freak out? He's known that. He doesn't care. Hi, baby. Hi. You never come see me when I'm filming. You never come see me when I'm filming. Oh, hi. What are you doing? You want to come read about vampires? Hi. This is Keats. But yeah, the shift from the golden moment to the dark moment is overall a very necessary moment for Lestat to survive vampirism. I firmly believe that. I think without this moment of existentialism, vampirism would have been almost incomprehensible to him. But because of this aspect of darkness that does worm its way into him and kind of break through that bit of optimism that he has, he can deal with the darkness that comes inevitably with vampirism. Because vampirism is a lot of things, but the idea that it is all this wonderful immortality is not at all true. We see the complexities and the horror of vampirism, and especially Lestat's vampirism. So seeing that kind of take place is something that happens with this golden moment to dark moment shift. All right, question 3 and the last question for part 1, Lelio Rising, says Lestat's childhood is full of moments that shape the man and the vampire he becomes. Obviously the monastery, the acting troupe, and the wolves are the most significant moments in his young life, but what other events, choices, and or actions carried weight in the person he is and becomes? So Alex, you said when reading the line in chapter 2, come into the great hall and play chess with your father, all I could think about was Claudia kicking Lestat's ass in chess during the latter half of season 1. Yeah, I'm really curious. I have a lot of thoughts on how I think Lestat's father is going to be handled in the show. And when I say that, it's just all thinking. For people that don't know, Lestat's father actually is in this book. He lives with Louis and Lestat at the Pont du Lac plantation house for a while. And obviously we've never seen that iteration come to the screen, nor do I care to, because that doesn't matter. This Louis is not real. But I think in the event of changing some aspects of Lestat's father, I think the show will give him a much more hands-on approach. A lot of Lestat's abuse is at the command of his father, but at the hands of his brothers. And I feel like we will see more of that physical abuse hands-on from his father. I think they may take away possibly like his father's blindness, because I think also if you do that, I think it makes this idea that Lestat had to be like the man of the house this kind of crazy concept, because seriously, like he had to become man of the house when his father would have been capable and his brothers were capable and he was the baby and like, you know, all that. But yeah, I think Lestat realizing in turn in season 3 how much he kind of became like his father, that he became what he hated so much, I think that would be utter devastation. I'm sure he's realized it in his time in his lovely shack in New Orleans, with nothing to do but think, and especially to think about Louis and Claudia for the last 70 years. So I'm sure he's actually already come to that realization, but we might actually see him discuss what coming to that realization really meant. Alice, you said that this probably is not going to be a popular opinion since so many people love her, but I think his relationship with his mother feeds a lot into his issues with abandonment. She's shown so often as cold and withdrawn. When she does give his affection, it's when she decides that he's done something that interests her. And it's no wonder that in turn Lestat is such an awful parent in the show. He's a combination of both of his, cold and aloof, and angry and violent. His wants and aspirations are often outright dismissed by his father and brothers, and while Gabrielle is a cool and interesting character in herself, damn, she shouldn't have been a mom, which I think that she would agree with. And in turn, this means that Lestat wants the attention of those that he loves, and you can see why. And then also with Gabrielle, she does show affection through giving gifts, the dogs, the horses, the money to go to Paris. And so when Lestat wants to win Louis over in the future, what does he do? He gift gives. Lestat's love language is very heavily gift giving, and we see it throughout here. When he gets the means to do so, he buys everyone presents. Everyone gets so many things. He doesn't think about money, he just thinks about buying things for people and making them happy, because how else do you tell them that you love them? And I think it's interesting because he is fairly good with words of affirmation and stuff as well. Obviously we see it in the show heavily. Those romantic monologues are killer. Season 2, episode 2 letter, think about you every day. Season 1, episode 1 at the church, I think about you every day, you know, like really killing it with the words. But gift giving is so significant for his love language, and yeah, trace that back to some mommy issues. Yike. Jana, you said befriending Nikki, having conversations with him, the witch's place, his mother's illness. And then Nikki, you said undoubtedly the witch's place because of the existentialism and religion and death that it brings. Savage, you said that his relationship with his father is crucial. His father's distance and harshness create a longing for love in Lestat, influencing his defiance and rejection of authority. Yeah. You also said that the acting troupe allows Lestat to express creativity and escape his family's confines, reinforcing his desire for recognition and foreshadowing his personality as a vampire. You went on to also say that Lestat's choice to leave his family signals his longing for independence and self-determination, setting the stage for his rebellion against human constraints. Melissa, you said that the fact that he's a provider for his family, he's the one putting food on the table, gives him the sense of purpose and satisfaction, and probably the confidence that he will be able to survive on his own when he runs away to Paris. I think it's important to note that Lestat is the youngest son, but he is very much parentified. He is the one taking care of everyone. And I think it is something that actually allows him and Louis to really bond, because Louis is parentified as a character as well. Louis, while being an oldest son and everything, his father dies, and the only other man in the house is Paul, who is not mentally able to deal with being in charge of all that. So there's nobody but Louis. And when Louis gets this responsibility of being in charge, he learns that they're drowning and has to figure out how to make the family survive. And that's Lestat too, you know, the family is drowning. and he has to make sure that they survive. He's got to put the food on the table. And I don't think either one of them really like doing it, but they do it, you know? And I think it's part of why they're such a good pair. I will turn everything into a Lestat conversation. We know that. But I think like part of why they're such a good pair is because this is something, this determination, this strength is something that is so inherently in both of them. And I think it's why Louis, despite everything, does survive as a vampire, unlike you know who. Yastra, you said that we learned from every line in Lelio Rising that Lestat was abused, neglected, ignored, berated, and felt at times invisible and at others unwanted by his parents. His father verbally and physically abused him with the help of his older brothers, and his mother preferred the company of her books. He's the youngest of 3 surviving sons, the 7th overall, and yet, despite being the baby of the family, he has to take on numerous responsibilities very young. And then, despite his terrible childhood, Lestat still grows up to be a brave, loving, and warm person who strives for happiness and meaning in his life. He really is the most optimistic little babe. Like, truly. Really is. Taylor, you said that one thing that stands out to me is Lestat wanting to learn how to read, but Gabrielle never teaching him despite her knowing how to. This, along with the monk at the monastery telling Lestat that he's a great scholar, feels important on how he views literacy. And I think it helps set up a balance of Lestat loving Gabrielle, but also resenting her. I think also a lot of how that played out in New Orleans in season 1 with Louis and Lestat are very much fighting and very much at odds with one another. Louis is living in books, and I'm sure that Lestat just sees that, and I think it just brings back those mommy issues that we just discussed. Yeah. Katie, you talked about this idea of like goodness and how Nikki doesn't believe in that at all, that he thinks them sinners, and Lestat just can't wrap his head around this idea because he strives so hard to be good and he feels like he's doing good. So this idea of goodness and vampire nature is one of the most important themes in the entire Vampire Chronicles, and we see it repeated and repeated. HP, you said that his family is just straight up abusive towards him, and although he never goes super in depth about this aspect of his life, the way in which he felt at the monastery, where he says, I didn't make other people unhappy or angry, and the fact that he thought this as a child is very telling to what his childhood was like. So sad. Listen, I'm gonna cry when we get whoever's cast as the 12-year-old Lestat. He's gonna be the saddest boy in the world. Oh my god. Carolyn, I'm gonna read most of your answer because I really liked it for this question, which is, for me, the biggest thing in Lestat's childhood is Gabrielle. His father did not love him. He was a nuisance to his father and brothers. Gabrielle never wanted children. She hated being a mother, but she is the only one that showed Lestat love, and it was on her own terms though. And you said, I mentioned it before, but I think it's very damaging that Gabrielle taught Lestat that when he felt emotional pain, he should shut down and make himself calm instead of move into action. And that's why in future vampire years, he'll, for example, do a crazy body swap with someone who's clearly evil or gallop away with the devil, rather than addressing the internal pain he's actually troubled by. I love, God, Tail of the Bite, he's so stupid. And he's like, okay, this guy wants to switch bodies. And then he goes to Louis and he's like, hey, this guy wants to switch bodies. And Louis like, that's fucking stupid, Lestat. And what does Lestat do? Switches bodies. And then he shows back up to Louis and he's like, hey. And Louis like, no. It's funny. It's not funny, but it's so funny. Like, literally, it's like, I'm gonna do this. Louis like, don't do that. It's gonna be bad. And so it's like, I'm gonna do it anyway. Then he does it and it's bad. And then he's like, so, hear me out. And Louis is so fucking sick of him in that book. It's so funny. I just could read that scene in Tale of the Body Thief repeatedly and just, God, he's so sick of that man. He's so sick of that man. This is not a Tale of the Body Thief conversation, but it makes me laugh every time. You went on to say that Gabrielle only offering love when Lestat is in his deepest emotional pain deeply affects how Lestat perceives himself, and that there's this unfulfillable need in him for love that he's never received. God, he really has never received it. And you said something here at the end that I think is really important, which is, a part of me thinks that Gabrielle is actually interested in Lestat as he grows older, as she wishes she could be him. And I think that she was not just merely neglectful of Lestat, but she actively did not want to teach him to read, because she knows that Lestat, as a man with knowledge and education, that would be how he could free himself from this place. And until she's dying, she needs him. And I think it's very interesting, this idea of Gabrielle is the way that Lestat gets out, right? She gives him the money that he needs to go to Paris. But she could have given that to him at any time. And she waits until she thinks she's not going to survive another winter, and has this whole conversation with him about it and everything. And she's known he's wanted to leave. He's wanted to leave since he was 12 years old. I mean, probably before then, but like definitely since he was 12 years old. And I think she keeps him there almost in this idea of like, if I'm trapped, you're trapped. Like, I can't have you get to go live the life that I was supposed to live. I think there's like a fairness issue. And especially, like, if we start to get in all up to Gabrielle's gender conversation and what that means, I think this idea that I really think she firmly believes she's supposed to be Lestat. That she is supposed to be the man that he is. And she resents him for being the man that she wants to be. I don't know. I think it's very loaded. And I think Gabrielle, I know like it's been talked about already that she is going to be the most significant character in addition to this season. I'm terrified to see her on the screen. I think she's a fascinating character. I can't sit here and say I love her by any means, but I think she's fascinating to read about. And I think it will be really telling to witness some of those interactions on the screen, and I'm really excited to see facial expressions. I think they're so telling, and I want to see what she's saying when she's doing some of these specific conversations. One of the things that was really difficult with this section was that it's a very large section and a very important section. I wanted to ask questions about the presence and about the witch's place, and I wanted to ask questions about Nikki and Lestat, and I wanted to ask questions about Gabrielle and Lestat, but I felt like I needed to prioritize certain things, and I think we have options to delve into those topics later, so I tried to focus on the things that were important very specifically for these sections. But there's so much to talk about and so much to discuss, and I feel like these two sections in particular are going to be so beautiful on the screen and done with a lot of care by our writing team and actors and everybody, and I'm very excited about it. I'm very nervous about it too, just in a general sense. I think it's really gonna hit us whenever season 3 airs that we are seeing the Vampire Lestat adapted for the first time, and how significant that is. And I'm so excited about it. I know everyone on set and all the writers and everyone, I know everyone's so excited about it, and I can't wait to see what they come up with. And I'm excited about a lot of the stuff you guys talked about, and I thank you so much for sending in such lovely and detailed answers once more, because this has been so fun and continues to be so fun, and I am very excited to get into our next session, which will be session 3 of Reid Along, the Vampire Lestat Book Club, in which we will be reading part 3, which is titled Viaticum for the Marquise. I did look up the word Viaticum. I did not know that one off the top of my head, which is defined as, I wrote it in the book, the Eucharist as given to a person near or in danger of death, or archaic meaning, a supply of provisions or an official allowance of money for a journey, which I think both uses of that definition are fascinating. And then the other section we will be reading is section 4, which is titled The Children of Darkness. Armand's little coven cult. Viaticum for the Marquise is roughly page 133 to 180, making it 47 pages. And part 4, The Children of Darkness, is page 183 to 235, making it about 52 pages, giving us right at 99 pages of reading for the next session. We are officially getting into some of what we've already seen in season 2 with our season 2 episode 3 1700s flashback, and we are also getting ready to get introduced to some very important and familiar characters and some new characters and characters that I think will shed light on a lot of season 2 goings on that we saw. We will be revisiting the Théâtre des Vampires again. So going back to some familiar stomping ground for those show watchers out there. And I'm so excited to talk about more of Gabrielle as she shows up a little bit as our Marquise, and to talk about this presence that's been haunting Lestat around, and all that these next couple sections are going to bring to light. But thank you so much for joining me for session 2. And I cannot wait to see what we talk about in session 3. Oh, do I need to be done talking for a minute? Okay. Okay. I'll take a break.